All right, there is a very specific reason why we played that particular video, which is that we have Briahna Joy Gray, Bernie Sanders' National Press Secretary, here to respond. I saw your tweets while that was all unfolding. Just react to that moment. There was a question that had been asked of another candidate about race. Comes to Bernie Sanders, he says, can I talk about climate change? Well, why don't you answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who have a lot of ink to spill about intersectionality, who seem not to really understand what the concept is all about. Bernie Sanders started his answer about climate change because climate change disproportionately affects Black and brown people. And for too long, we have divvied up all of these issues into their little buckets, and that's part of why we haven't been able to solve them comprehensively. So there were a lot of people who were quick to clap and thinking that that was a dunk moment, but what ended up happening was that Bernie Sanders ended up showing that they were more interested in a kind of a viral gotcha moment than substantively listening to how you need to deal with multiple issues at the same time, intersecting issues to really help the communities that they say they claim to care so much about.
Yeah, I mean, I knew it was going to be immediately seized upon, and I saw it being discussed. Where do you think the impulse for that gotcha came from? What did you think?
I mean, look, there is a critique of Bernie Sanders that says when you talk about economics so much, when you foregone economics, it must be necessarily at the expense of other issues, particularly issues that disproportionately affect Black and brown people that are often historically waylaid in the effort to appeal to kind of a larger mass. But what's so interesting about the Bernie Sanders campaign and this approach is to say when you actually are talking about class and when you're using class as one of the many intersections that should make up intersectionality, when you don't treat intersectionality as kind of like oppression Olympics, and you actually understand that what the Combahee River Collective women who actually invented the terms meant is that different, any one person is going to be affected in many different ways. So Black people are affected by environmental concerns. Obviously, there are Black women, Black men, Black trans people, and that runs the gamut. And so people need to be open to the idea of an economic message because when you are able to tie economics into these broader subsections, you're able to win and have a populist message without throwing those historically marginalized groups under the bus or making white people feel like they are in fact marginalized now.
Well, and it's a bizarre thing to say your identity is over here and your life is over there.
Right.
Those things are obviously all mixed up together.
Right.
I want to ask you though, just overall, what did you think of the night? How did you, obviously, I'm sure you thought Senator Sanders performed well.
He did.
But what did you think were the standout moments there?
So ironically, one of the things I really appreciated, even though I wished that Bernie Sanders got a bigger piece of it, was the exchange about campaign finance. Because now that we're in a world where we have fewer people on the stage, and there's a little bit more, that was one of the few moments of the night where they were allowed to have an exchange as opposed to delivering answers to the pundits and back and forth. You were able to parse out what's really at stake here. And you got some illuminating facts about other candidates and where they stand that haven't come out before because others have tried to kind of flatten the difference between especially Warren and Bernie and what their standards are for taking super PAC money. Bernie Sanders is right when he says he is the only candidate who's sworn off large donations point blank period, including during the general election, and that matters.
All right, well, now's a good time to bring in, actually, we have two great people to bring in. Let's turn to Jennifer Holdsworth, who is a surrogate and advisor for Mayor Pete, who is part of several of those feisty exchanges on campaign finance. The wine cave came up a number of times.
You're all invited to mine.
Yeah. Thank you. I will take you up on that. And the press better not be in there.
Yeah.
Now, what did you make of the night? How did you think the mayor performed? What were the standout moments for you?
I think he performed really well. And I think anybody who was questioning whether the mayor could fight back against Donald Trump on a debate stage got their answer tonight, if that's something that they were thinking. And I thank Senator Warren for preparing the mayor for that eventual moment this fall. But aside from that, look, I think that there's real questions that people are asking about how the different candidates are running their primaries, and I think Pete's answer was great. I think he said, look, we have to be armed to the teeth in order to fight Donald Trump and the forces that are coming at us in every way, shape, or form. Now, while the format was better, it still doesn't allow for a complete extended answer. And what the mayor, I'm sure, really wanted to say is that the average donation to his campaign is $32, and that 98% of the donations are under $200, and that 85% of the donations are under $50. There's over 700,000 individual donors to Mayor Pete's campaign, and over $2 million of that came from those 700,000 donors.
See,
So
now
I think that there's an extended conversation that should be had here. But as far as the exchange is concerned, I think that they're strengthening each other. But I've said this before, I think this conversation at this point is played out. I think that we know where everybody stands. Pete has opened every single one of his fundraisers to the press, including that famous wine cave one. The pictures came from a reporter. So I think that, it's a conversation about who's supporting whom, but everybody on that stage has the same values, and everybody on that stage wants to use the money that they're raising to defeat Donald Trump, and that's the important point here.
Jennifer, I wanted to get your reaction to that moment with Amy Klobuchar in particular, in which she talked about how Pete, is running on this electability issue, but how he did lose a statewide race in Trump country in the state of Indiana. What is the Buttigieg campaign response to that? Because what I saw is that what the women in the race, particularly Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar, were saying, we're like, look, you don't need to rely on any prescience of electability. We are United States senators. Whereas Mayor Pete is saying, we only won about 11,000 votes, and extrapolating that to being able to win the presidency is a bit of a jump. What's the response?
The statewide race was more than a decade ago, and he didn't have the experience that he has now. He was building name recognition in the state, and it was still a deeply, deeply conservative area. Mayor Pete got elected when he was still had not come out, and then in his second election as mayor, he had written a very personal essay and came out to his residents at a time when Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana, and I think that's really important perspective there. And for him to be able to do that and to be able to speak to voters across the country and resonate with them the way that he has, there's a reason for that, and it doesn't really have anything to do with electability. It has to do with meeting people where they are and talking about their lives. A lot of the candidates up on the stage were constantly saying I and me, and sometimes we, but the we is what's most important. And when Mayor Pete is in Iowa and he's in New Hampshire, and he just took a southern swing last week, so he's not only focused on the early states, he's talking to voters about the issues that are affecting them, and that's something that resonates in Indiana and beyond.
Let me bring in Adam Green, who is co-founder of the Progressive Change Campaign Committee and also a surrogate and supporter of Elizabeth Warren. Let me first get your reaction to the conversation about money in politics, since your candidate also was involved in that conversation very directly.
Sure. Well, I think that, just like Pete uses insurance industry talking points to bash Medicare for all, tonight he used establishment talking points to bash shilly progressives who don't want to win and are putting one hand behind their back. In fact, both Bernie and Warren have raised more money than Pete, as he does big money fundraisers in $900 rich people caves. So let's just get that on the table. I thought that overall, a lot of candidates had good ad hoc answers tonight. But in this impeachment moment, there was one candidate who consistently made the case that the best way to defeat a corrupt president is by addressing corruption directly. That included campaign finance, but it also drew connections to why don't parents have childcare? Why are students under the shackles of student debt? Because of corruption in our government. And I was so impressed by how remarkably consistent Warren was in her opening, throughout all of her answers, and in the end, at driving home an anti-corruption message. And one thing we've seen is that if anything unites Democratic, Republican, independent voters, it is not a left-right debate, it's an inside versus outside debate taking on corruption.
So Adam, I do want to ask you this. Elizabeth Warren had a bit of a slide in the polls up to this point. Are we on the show, and I've seen a lot of other analysis to this point as well, which is that there needed to be a big moment. There didn't seem to be a big moment, or was there one in your view? And do you think it was enough to arrest that slide and really start to bring her back up in the early states and overall nationally? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good point. So as we talked about one debate ago, I attribute the temporary dip in the polls to just the controversy around, getting attacked, mostly by Pete with his insurance industry talking points. Sorry.
Or just pointing out policy.
I promise no fighting here to all of you.
This is a friendly discussion.
By the way, these are all great friends.
These are great friends.
We respect. Go ahead, Adam.
Trying to model Warren's hallmark for consistency by
and I am following the rules of the road.
That's right.
The reality is, though, this is the kind of attack that we're going to get from Donald Trump. We saw in 2016 that he managed to get to the left of Elizabeth Warren on certain kinds of talking points. Because it doesn't, on Hillary, I'm so sorry. On certain talking points. And the problem is this: it doesn't matter what Trump himself has done. The hypocrisy angle is dead, and we need to learn that lesson sooner rather than later. At the end of the day, Trump isn't claiming to be independent somewhat because of his wealth, but not independent from Wall Street. He's not claiming to have kind of what some centrists call purity test. So he can make these kinds of attacks, the same kinds of attacks that were thrown around the stage last night at candidates like Elizabeth Warren, at candidates like Pete Buttigieg. And at the end of the day, integrity is what's going to beat Trump. Because you'll notice none of that fire came Bernie's way. Because the reality is, that, what you said is right. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have shown that the old rules of fundraising are no longer true, that you can do things differently. But that also holds true for earning money, raising money during a general election. And so I think that we need constantly to look at who's leading the fight here, who's willing to do not just as what is ethically right, but what also resonates with average Americans, because they understand what corruption is. They understand what money in politics means. They don't have to have it explained to them or handheld the way that certain members in the media is. And that is what ultimately is going to beat Trump. And that's why Bernie continuously polls as the best candidate to beat Trump over and over again.
Adam, I know you wanted to jump in.
And just to agree with that and close the loop on your question. So yeah, Trump campaigned railing against Wall Street speeches, corporate trade deals, and the corruption in Washington. He was lying about all that stuff, but he tapped into a very real shake up the system sentiment that Elizabeth Warren tapped into for months that fueled her rise. So last debate represented a return to stability. She wasn't under attack, and a lot of people were like, okay, she's weathered that storm. Tonight, I think people saw what they love about Elizabeth Warren, which is her relentless focus on taking on systemic corruption, taking on corporate actors, and fighting for everyday people.
Well, let me ask you guys all this, which is maybe a little unfair since no Biden surrogate was willing to join us tonight.
For the record,
however,
they were invited.
They were definitely invited. But look, while this conversation is going on, Joe Biden remains at the top of the polls, at least nationally. And certainly with Super Tuesday states, he's in a very strong position. So Jennifer, what's the plan to be able to surpass Joe Biden?
Well, one of the things is that I think it's interesting that the Midwestern mayor who doesn't have six figures in the bank is being portrayed by the millionaires and billionaires on stage as the insider who is akin to money and corruption. So I'm going to reject that right there, call out the hypocrisy, and say that authenticity is probably what's going to win the day here. And I think that that had a lot more to do with Senator Warren's dip in the polls than any perceived attacks on actual policy that she would face in the fall from President Trump anyway. So if you can't pass your own purity test, I think it's very difficult to level that at other people. Switching to Biden.
What purity test did she not pass?
Well, she's talking about holding closer fundraisers, which she did right up until the moment she decided to run for president and then transferred the money that was in her Senate account to her president account. I, in fact, attended some of those fundraisers when I was in New Jersey when she was running against Scott Brown. So I think it's a little disingenuous to level that attack now. When she did it, she decided for political reasons not to accept that money because she thought it would be good for her running for president. But look, I don't, you know,
quick response.
That's not the real point. Just like, oh, she wants work for corporations as a lawyer is not the real point. The point is, if she was now advocating for big corporations and you discover that she used to work for corporations, there's an aha moment, right? If she was now advocating for corporations and billionaires, given that record, that'd be an aha moment. But it's not. She is fighting them. Pete is whining and dining with insurance industry execs, Verizon execs, Amazon execs, big tech execs, and then advocating for their agenda. That's the problem. He's surrounding himself with the viewpoints of those people as opposed to everyday people like.
I don't think advocating for poverty is really advocating for the insurance industry. But be that as it may, I'm going to switch to the Biden question because that's the one that you asked me, and I want to follow the debate rules here. Look, I think VP Biden had a really good night. I think that he came out fighting. I think that this was his best debate. And I think that people underestimate him, and they're making fun of the No Malarkey tour, and they're saying that his numbers are soft in the other states. They're not. They're not. I tend to think that Pete is the front runner in this race. That's why I'm here as his surrogate. I think that people are responding to him and why he's constantly shown as leading in the early state polls and rising in states outside of that. But Joe Biden is a force to be reckoned with. And I think that people forget that it's not just
the people of color away from Joe Biden, because that's the argument.
Core question.
That's the question
for Mayor Pete and for I think a lot of the other candidates. And that is the more people get to know Mayor Pete, the more that they understand his agenda, the more that they resonate with him, and the more that he's able to sell his message to them, and they come around to it. You'll see in the media markets where Pete has has appeared more, like in Illinois, his numbers with voters of color are much, much higher than they are in sections of the country that have never been exposed to Mayor Pete's message. So I think as long as he goes and he meets where voters are, they'll start to come to his side.
Brianna, I want to be able to give you a response to that money in politics point first, and then to the Biden question that Crystal asked.
Sure. Well, just to this last point, you know, Bernie Sanders is #1 with voters of color in this country, and that's no accident. I think that there was an extent to which exposure does work. But really, it's also the work that we've been doing with the Latino community. We're doing the first ever Spanish language debate over the weekend, hosted by AOC. It's being able to attract all of these surrogates, the most diverse and kind of notable surrogates, Congress people in Congress, because of policies that are farther reaching than anybody else's. To the money in politics point, look, I kind of agree with this point about that you made about consistency and integrity. But I think part of what's caused the slip in both of your candidates is backing away from positions that they initially took that were incredibly popular. Backing away from initial positions on health care. Pete Buttigieg coming off initially saying that he was for Medicare for all, kind of re-upping that tweet from back in the day saying, I am unequivocally for Medicare for all, and then shying away from it. And that has partly to do with the fact that Medicare for all is overwhelmingly popular, not just among Democrats, but among all Americans and independents too. But that the fact that you have wavered in that way makes voters uncertain about what you're actually going to stand for and when you're in office. And that's why Bernie's age and his experience and his long term in Congress and in the public eye is nothing but a credit to him. Because while other candidates are having to make excuses about why they voted for NAFTA or why they voted for the Iraq War or why they voted so that students can't use bankruptcy to get rid of their student loan debt, Bernie Sanders is on the right side of every issue every time, and voters don't have to wonder who he's going to be when he's occupying the Oval.
And what about Biden? How do you knock him off of his perch at number one?
Well, it's happening. We are steadily climbing in the polls. You might not see it on MSNBC, but Bernie is I tweet it every time I can.
MSNBC here, Brianna.
Don't worry.
We
No
are
love
gaining,
lost on this network.
I mean, look, we are gaining faster
Shameless
than
playing for the crowd right now.
I know my audience. The truth is there. We are gaining faster than any other candidate, and we have been consistent. So you know what? There are people who said Bernie should attack more. Bernie should, get on some of these, get on Twitch. Do some of these things that are kind of performative. I mean, we are on Twitch. Bernie's not often, but I am. But at the end of the day, slow and steady seems to be winning the race because people really, after all of the upheaval that we've seen over the last 3 years, they want someone they can trust.
Yeah, Adam,
Right, Adam,
let's give you the last word.
You got to have the response.
Respond on the healthcare thing, but I also want to hear about Biden and how you think he performed
The Biden
tonight.
question is key.
Sure. Well, no one's given any ground on Medicare for all. I mean, Elizabeth Warren took incoming fire because she was out there defending Medicare for all, and she's put forth a different theory of the case on passing it. I would argue that it actually has a better chance of passing it and would do it sooner. But I have complete respect for Bernie Sanders for mainstreaming that issue and putting it in the national dialogue. With Biden, I mean, what we've seen is that those voters who have seen him most up close and personal don't like him as much. The early states is where he's faltering. And I would just draw an analogy with Rudy Giuliani, who back in the day was losing all the early states, but was like, Florida is my firewall.
Right.
Well, it turns out firewalls don't work if you don't enter with momentum. Joe Biden cannot afford to lose early states and then say, oh, Super Tuesday after all 4 first states go. No, that's not going to work. One thing we saw today, I will say, is that Black Lives Matter South Bend held a media call and talked about the Pete Buttigieg record on race, about parents of victims of shooting by police coming to him and being given a cold shoulder, being told, call my office, and then never getting a call back. And I think that there's a lot of stories coming out of South Bend that are going to continue coming out of South Bend that show that he's not the person who's going to pick up the slack when Bernie drops the
Jennifer,
ball.
let me give you a chance to respond to that. But let me
absolutely.
also add something we've talked about here, which was the Douglas plan for Black America, where several of the endorsees, supposed endorsees, didn't actually back the plan. A number of the endorsers were white when they had all been represented as having been Black. Just to speak to those issues that Adam raises in that one as well.
There are over 50 local elected officials from communities of color and activists who have endorsed the mayor from South Bend. And there is a small vocal minority in the town who are unhappy with some of the mayor's leadership initiatives. He always makes a point to listen to every single one of them. It doesn't mean that his answers were always satisfactory to those individual people, but he has always made the opportunity to be heard and to listen to them, which is why he has overwhelming support coming out of South Bend. And unfortunately, if the Black Black Lives Matter protesters from South Bend had listened to the leaders of color who were hosting an event to talk about their support for the mayor, instead of interrupting it and ripping away the microphone from a woman of color who was trying to tell her story, they might have heard just what kind of experience that they have had with the mayor's leadership in South Bend.
Jennifer, also please respond to that point on the Douglas plan. I do think it's important.
It is, and I think that when you put out a list of that size, you have to make sure you do your due diligence. Everybody who was listed on that list did participate in signing off on the Douglas plan and did give the campaign their express permission to use their name. It was never represented as a list of all persons of color. It was never represented that way. It was never released that way. It was never talked about that way in the press. There were some who perceived it that way, but I think that the mayor has gone out of his way to reach out to those individuals who did say that they were upset for being included, and also address that with them personally.
Was the reporting on this is our own, Ryan Graham, close friend of the show, was just on here a minute ago, who did the reporting that it was an opt-out, basically. If you don't respond to this email by 4 p.m., you've endorsed it. Is that the right way? Is that a respectful way to treat this process?
No, and I don't think that that's entirely accurate either, that there were a lot of conversations that the campaign, both on a local and a national level, had with those individuals. But I think that you'll see a variety of the presidential campaigns who have put out lists and endorsements who unfortunately have problems with being on those lists. It's not unique to the Mayor Pete campaign, and when you're trying to make sure that everything is accurate, there are some things that can be slipped up. I think if the campaign did make a mistake on that, I don't have a personal inside view as to whether they made an actual mistake about that, but they'll remedy it if they did.
I'm curious which elements of the Douglas plan were implemented in South Bend when he was mayor for 8 years.
Do you want to
go ahead.
respond?
Go ahead.
Do you want to respond?
Okay. He was the first mayor to create an initiative to make sure that city contracts were awarded to persons of color. That was one of the initial points, and there was actually misreporting on that it was a low percentage when in fact it was between 12 and 15%. I believe 12. So that was the first thing. There were a variety of housing and home.
To say it was 1%. Maybe that's
and that's incorrect. The actual statistics show that it was 12%.
Well, this is
go ahead, Brianna.
Last thought here, and then we have to get to our
this
panel.
muddied waters is a little bit part of the issue, right? Because at the end of the day, in 2016, just in Wisconsin alone, 88,000 black voters stayed home because of whatever you wanted to call it. Lack of enthusiasm about Hillary Clinton, misinformation on Facebook. And at the end of the day, we need someone who is enthusiastic, who's able to draw enthusiastic crowds to the polls in 2020. And I think that some of this toxicity isn't going to be what gets us there.
Which is why it's important to focus on the fact that Mayor Pete has consistently drawn the biggest crowds in Iowa.
And it's why we need someone who persists.
All right, everybody got their shots in.
I think everyone can agree we were very fair.
To say that we are all on the same side here.
I also think it's fair to say that all of your candidates have a lot more energy and enthusiasm behind them than Joe Biden does.
That's right.
So we'll end on that.
We can end on that very
listen,
good
like I said, great friends of the show. We appreciate each one of you being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. It was really great.
Coming up, we're going to have our extra special Team Rising panel. But first, let's take a look back at a couple more moments from the debate tonight.
That's right.